In this video, I'm going to show you how to take a 4-tiered maxi skirt, mine's from Brandy Melville, and turn it into an embellished dress. For this project, you're going to need your skirt, lace, ribbon insertion lace, I got 2 different types, trim, ribbon, elastic, pins, a seam ripper, scissors, measuring tape, and thread. This skirt is made up of 4 different tiers and a lining. I'm going to start by removing the 3 bottom tiers from the top tier. You can remove this with a seam ripper, or you can use your scissors and just cut the 2 pieces apart. Because the fabric was serged, I found scissors a little easier. The second step is to detach the lining, which again you can use a mix of your seam ripper and scissors to do this task. So I've now broken it into 3 pieces, the top tier of my dress, the 3 bottom tiers, and the lining. We're going to start by working on the top tier, which is going to become our bodice. We're going to pin it so it fits comfortably around the top of the chest. And then we can take it off and cut away that excess fabric that we just pinned. Before we add any embellishments, it's important that we iron out our fabric. Then, grabbing the lining that we kept, we're going to cut out a replica piece of the bodice that we just cut. Because the fabric is quite thin and white, so it can be a little see-through, I wanted to create a double layer for our top piece. We're now ready to add our embellishments. I'm going to show 2 different ways to add these embellishments. The first is to fold over the fabric twice and create a hem and iron that down. This is what I'm going to do for adding my more delicate lace. So as you can see here, I'm going to insert my lace into that gap, making sure to include my piece of lining as well. And do any trimming to make sure that the lining and the top layer fit together. And then we're going to pin on our first piece of lace. Keeping in mind I'm going to be adding a top layer of lace, but we'll be doing that in another step. Next, we're going to mark out where we're going to place our second element of embellishment. There's no right or wrong way of doing this, and it only really depends on how you want it to look. I used my measuring tape to make sure that I was placing everything equally, and I also decided I wanted to add another lace detail in the back. In the end, I marked out 4 new detailed strips, and then 2 lace details in the front and the back. And I also decided to make the bodice a little shorter. Now I'm marking out with pins where I placed my details, and then I'm going to trim right down the center. I'm cutting through the lining and the outer layer. And then I'm going to place right sides together and pin it down of my ribbon detail and my fabric. And I'm going to do that for both sides. So as you can see, this is just the process of inserting this detail into my bodice. And I'm going to do the exact same for all of the details that I marked out. There's no limit to how many strips you can add to your fabric, and it's really just a preference on what kind of details you'd like. I'm going to do the same lace detail that I did in the front in the back. So I'm going to create a hem on both sides, folding my fabric over twice, and then pin the lace on top. In total, I have 4 strips that I'm inserting into the bodice, and then I have 2 lace details. And then I'm going to sew along everywhere that I pinned. For the 2 lace details, I'm going to be sewing those with a top stitch. It's important to iron this out at every step of your sewing. Now I'm just going to tidy up my seams and trim away any of the excess thread or fabric. And then I'm going to go over those seams with a zigzag stitch. The zigzag stitch is to prevent your fabric from fraying. And as you can see, it looks a lot cleaner. Now I'm going to do a top stitch on all of the seams that I just sewed, but this is totally optional. And here's what it looks like if you do your top stitch. And that really will lock in those threads in the back as well. The next step, we're going to add a bias strip to finish off the top of our fabric. And we're going to cut this strip from our piece of lining. So I'm just cutting out a strip of about 5 centimeters and long enough to wrap around the top of the fabric. And then I'm going to pin where I'm going to sew my binding piece so that it fits perfectly around the top of my bodice. And then I'm going to cut, leaving a little bit of seam allowance. And then I'm going to sew along where I pinned. And then I'm going to trim away all that excess fabric on the edge to create a smaller seam allowance. Now to finish off creating our bias strip, we want to flip our fabric inside out, fold our fabric over once, iron it down, and then fold it over a second time. Then from the right side of the fabric, we're going to place pins in the seam, catching the fabric on the other side, making sure to iron plenty as you go. And then you're going to sew in the seam where you pinned, catching the fabric on the other side. And this is what your bias strip should look like. Now we're going to add the rest of the lace to the bias edge that we just created. We're going to attach it sewing right over the existing seam. Once we reach the end, we can trim the excess, leaving enough to fold over and sew with a zigzag stitch. And just to lock it in, I'm going to sew the other side as well. Now I'm going to do the exact same bias strip technique that I did for the top for the bottom of the bodice. So we're going to start by attaching right side of the bias strip to the right side of the bodice fabric, measuring as we pin. And then I'm going to sew along where I pinned. Then trim away any of the excess fabric poking out from beneath the bias strip. Then iron what you just sewed, flip the fabric inside out, fold it over once, iron it down, and then fold it over a second time, iron it down, and place your pins. And then you're going to sew along where you pinned, right in the seam, catching the layer of fabric in the back. Now we're moving on to the piece with the bottom 3 tiers. The top is a little gathered because of the serge stitch, so I'm going to trim that away and then iron it out. I'm going to create a channel to insert an elastic to add a little shape to the dress. I want my channel to be wide enough to fit my elastic and include a 0.5 centimeter excess. So on the wrong side of the fabric, I'm just going to fold the fabric over 1 centimeter and then fold it over again to the width of the elastic plus 0.5 centimeters. It helps to use your measuring tape while doing the ironing. So now I'm going to do 2 stitches on either side of the channel, sewing really close to the edge. We're not going to sew the channel the entire way, and we're actually going to leave a small gap to be able to insert our elastic. Now we're going to attach our bodice to our 3-tiered piece. We're going to pin it right sides together, pinning at the bottom bias strip that we created for the bodice, and on the top stitch of the channel that we created for our elastic. Now we want to measure out how tight we want our elastic, making sure to leave a little extra for overlap. Now we're going to insert our elastic into our channel through the gap that we left open. To do this, I like to use a safety pin. I'm going to sew it in a later step, so right now I'm just going to pin the ends of the elastic together. And now I'm going to drape my sleeves. So I'm just placing my fabric, again the excess lining, on the mannequin and cutting out roughly the shape that I want my sleeves to be. Then I'm going to pin it down to keep in place and then trim away more precisely the shape of my sleeve, keeping in mind to leave a 1 centimeter seam allowance around every edge of the sleeve. I'm going to be adding details in a bit, but first I'm going to cut out 3 identical pieces using the first one as a stencil, so I'm going to end up with 4 sleeves. Then I'm going to sew the 2 pairs right sides together, sewing just along the edge and leaving the ends open so after I can flip them right side out. Now with the edges sewn, we're going to flip both sleeves right side out, and then iron them flat. Then we're going to tuck in the 1 centimeter seam allowance on both ends and iron that down as well. And we're now ready to add our sleeve details. I'm going to place ribbon insertion lace as well as a trim, and then I'm going to put ribbon through my lace detail. I'm going to start by sewing on the insertion lace, and I'm just going to do that with a straight stitch on both sides of the lace. Then I'm going to insert 2 pieces of ribbon from each end of the sleeve so they can meet at the top and I can tie a bow. I'm doing this with a dull machine needle to help me pull the ribbon through. Also, when working with ribbon, I like to cut it on an angle to help prevent it from fraying. And with my 2 pieces of ribbon through, I can tie a bow at the top of the sleeve. I also left a little bit of the lace on either end to be able to tuck the raw edge to the other side of the sleeve. And we can now pin the sleeve to our dress. It does help to try it on at this phase to make sure that you like the placement of the sleeve. I'm going to sew the sleeve to the bodice as well as to the lace trim to keep it in place. So I'm going to do 2 stitches on the front and 2 stitches on the back. And we're going to do the exact same, but just the mirror image for the other sleeve. Again, using the excess fabric from the lining, I cut a long strip that I'm going to be able to tie around the waist and turn into a bow. I'm going to iron out that piece, fold it in 1 centimeter on either side, and then fold it in half. This is going to cover up the elastic as well as create a bow detail in the back. And then I'm going to fold the ends in to create a triangle point at the end of my strip. And then I'm going to sew along the edge, including the 2 points, with as small of a seam allowance as I can. Then I'm going to attach the ribbon to the dress just at the 3 points where I placed my pins. And I'm also going to sew together the elastic with a zigzag stitch and then close the elastic channel. So here I'm just sewing the elastic with a zigzag stitch, then I'm closing up the channel, and then I'm attaching the bow detail with a few stitches at the front of the dress. The final step is to add any sort of decorative trim that you like. I decided to place my trim in between the tiers of my dress, as well as along my bow waistband. You could also place them on your sleeves or the trim of the dress or wherever else you like. And you're all done! Thank you so much for watching, and if you liked this video, please subscribe.